Welcome to a quick brown bag that I am doing on basically how to do 2D UI in Unity. I'm going to be looking this way because my screen's this way. You're all over there. Deal with it. So I hope you can all see my screen now. And what I've got here is just an empty scene, file new scene, and I've just changed the background to be like an AR style panorama, just so you know it's a good way of making sure your contrast and everything is right with your UI elements. And yeah, so I'm using the tool layout in Unity here as well. So over here is my my scene, my inspector stuff, my hierarchy, that's what it's called, and my project stuff's down here. And the inspector's over this side. So just if you're unfamiliar with this layout, that's what I do. All right, so just to get started, UI is different to 3D type stuff. One of the main ways that UI stuff is different to 3D stuff is that it's measured in pixels rather than in meters. So you've got all those considerations to keep in mind. You've got devices of different screen sizes, orientation. So you've got portrait and landscape. And yeah, they're all different resolutions and that as well. Those things also might change at runtime. I could grab my phone and turn it on to its side, and then I've got to think about how my UI is going to look in those cases. Often it's simpler to just say, you only get portrait, deal with it. So the UI submenu here contains all the elements for UI. So I'll just add a button to start with. There we go. I've added a button. So it's pretty easy to just add the UI elements. They're there. But what you get when you do that is you get a canvas element sitting on top. And the canvas element is what's essentially everything that renders, every UI that renders has to sit under a canvas. It's kind of like it's the canvas on which your UI is drawn on top of. So if you've got MRTK installed too, there'll be options here for that, which we won't get into at the moment. So there's a few options in the canvas which change the way that UI elements are rendered. So the first is pixel perfect. So that'll make sure that you don't get those weird sub-pixel rendering. I haven't dealt with this one that much, but if you're scaling your screen, it just prevents elements from appearing sort of on half a pixel and then getting blurry edges. It keeps it nice and crisp. And that's probably all we need. And render mode here tells it where to render. So you've got a canvas, and by default, it renders in screen space. So if you've got an 800 by 600 screen, your canvas will be 800 pixels by 600 pixels, and that'll just be that. You can also render this in world space, so that if you then make it 800 by 600, it'll be 800 meters by 600 meters, so it'll be really, really big, and it'll be in the world as well, so you can move it around in 3D. So you can use this if you're using the HoloLens and you want a 2D UI that's attached to your hand or something like that. Make a small UI that's just sitting there and use your normal UI elements to get through that. And MRTK can handle the event delegation for taps and things like that for you. But we're just focusing on screens at the moment, so we'll leave it in screen space overlay. I've never actually used camera, so I don't know what that is. Cool. The next important thing is this UI scale mode, which I'm going to get into, but not right now. But yeah, I'll cover that. So if we go into our button itself, the button is made up of two components, or two game objects. The first of which is just the button itself. So this contains the outline of the button, and it has a script on it to render the image and a script on it for the button itself. So this handles the interaction. Out of the box, this is actually quite powerful. It looks like it's only a few things, but it's pretty much as powerful as the MRTK one, in my opinion. So it allows you to have an image which represents your button, and you can also tint that image with a particular color depending on how you're interacting with it. So if I just hit play now to show you what I mean, it's all at high speed. Wow. There we go. Cool. So you can see we've got a normal color, which is just white, a highlighted color. So as I put my mouse over it, it changes slightly. Let's just do this. Yellow, pressed, red, selected, pink, and then disabled. There. So you can see that those things tint the image with those colors. So I can highlight over it. I can press it. And when it's selected to, it's a different color. So I can select it on, select off, And you can just got some nice fading between those as well. It's quite a good feeling control just for out of the box and very simple. The image itself can render in a few different ways. The most common of which is this sliced mode here. So you can see the source image is just a default little rounded rectangle type thing, but the image type is set to sliced. And what that does is it cuts up the image into 9 things. This is very similar to how we used to have to do rounded corners in CSS back in the days, if you remember. So it'll slice it here. It'll render this at this corner here. It'll repeat this for the whole length of the top, and then it'll render the other corner here. So it essentially means that no matter what dimensions I make this button, the image will give it nice rounded corners and things like that. So you can do quite a lot with that effect. Now, when it comes to resizing though, just out of the box, this button has positioned itself in such a way that its anchor point is at the middle center, and its positioning and widths and heights are all relative to that. So what that means is as I move it around, it's always going to say 79 pixels to the left of the middle of the screen, no matter what. If I change this anchor point to be on the left instead, you see it maintains its position. It updates this number for you, but now whenever I move it around, it stays stuck to the left-hand side of the screen instead of into the middle of the screen. So where this is helpful is if you want your buttons, let's say you're doing like a fab style button, like in material design, you might want to anchor it to the bottom right. You tell it to be, let's say 80 pixels each way. Make it 80 by 80. So you get a button like this because you're anchoring it in the bottom right. You see it just stays in the bottom right no matter how I move the thing. I can move it up and down and it stays stuck in the bottom right. So that's anchoring. You can choose to anchor it wherever you want. There's also a stretch mode, which is, so let's say I want it stretched all the way along the bottom like a little status bar type thing. So I can choose bottom and stretch. And then instead of getting like a left and a width, what I get is a left and a right. So if I want to make it 20 pixels away from each side, 20 pixels up from the bottom, and then 60 high. Hang on, let me just move it up a bit. I'll get into why that happened in a sec. So 40 pixels up. Then we can see it stretches to accommodate the size of the screen as well. So it's a pretty powerful system, this anchoring system. You can do a lot with it. So you may have noticed that 20 up from the bottom doesn't quite look the same as 20 from the left and right. And the reason for that is that the pivot points, the reason for that is because it's on stretch on this one. Let's try bottom center. Bottom left. Yeah. So yeah, I'll just set it to bottom left now so I can explain this concept, which is the one of like where the pivot is. So at the moment, the pivot is set to 0.5, 0.5, which means for the button, oh, by the way, this little 2D button here takes you to 2D design mode rather than 3D design mode, which is a bit more like screen space sized. And this pivot here sort of says where the distances are relative to, if that makes sense. So what I'm saying here is position X is 20 pixels from the left, and it's saying that the pivot point of this button is 20 pixels from the left. So if I move the pivot to 0, which will put it all the way over to the left here, and then change that back to 20, we can now rest assured that that is 20 pixels from the left. Like the left-hand side is 20 pixels from the left, not the middle of the button is 20 pixels from the left. So this can be useful if you want to anchor things in the center. You do want your pivot to be in the center because it's easy to say, like, I want it to be 0, like I want the center to be 0 pixels from the center, like it's all lined up. And so generally you make your pivot match where you want it to be or where like the natural origin of your UI element is. So for a progress bar, it might be the bottom left is the right place for it. As for a button, like a fab button might make sense to position it based on where the middle of the button is, not where the corner of the button is. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. So the other place where this comes into play, let me just set the Y pivot to 0, set this to 0.5, and I'll move it up to 20 pixels. I'm going to put it on stretch as well. Okay, so I can see that stretching from side to side, so that's cool. But if I put it in a tiny screen like this, it's not going to be very fun. Or even if it's a big screen like on a tablet, it's a pretty tall button to have for a widescreen control. We might want that button to shrink down or change as I'm changing that resolution. So it looks pretty good in portrait, but it looks bad in landscape. And the way we sort of try and solve this is with canvas scaler, which is another component on the canvas element. So the canvas scaler has 3 different ways to scale the UI with different screen sizes. So by default, it's a constant pixel size. So that means 20 pixels is always 20 pixels, and it doesn't really care what your screen size is. It'll always be 20 pixels from the bottom. The other one that I use a lot is scale with screen size. So in this case, you sort of give it a reference resolution for your screen size. So by default, the reference resolution is 800 by 600. I like to change this to whatever my the most common resolution that I'm going to have for my devices. So if I'm targeting Android, they're usually 1080p. So and if I want it to be a portrait, I want 1080 for X and 1920 for Y. You can see that sort of shrunk the button all the way down the bottom because that's my reference resolution. So what I just want to do with that is make it bigger. So it might be better as 180 pixels high, and 40 pixels from each side. And then I've got to make the text bigger to suit. All right, so that has so that's how it's going to look like on a 1920 on a 1080 screen. And if I resize it, we can see that the button actually grows to keep that sort of those values equal. It increases the aspect ratio of them. And what I've set it up to at the moment, it matches the width. So as I make it wider, it'll scale up appropriately, keeping that aspect ratio for the button. So if I change the height, in this case, it doesn't actually change. So the canvas scaler chooses a particular dimension to use as its sort of baseline size, and then scales the whole UI based on that. And you can move this slider to make the different bits if you care more about height or if you care more about width. So if I wanted that button to change size as I made it smaller and bigger in that direction, I would scale it with height instead of width. So we can see the width here. The button doesn't actually change size. Are there any questions about that? We'll stop there because it's all about scaling and positioning. Cool. I must be a really good orator. All right, let me just get back to my notes and see what's next. Wow, okay, I've actually covered a fair bit. Okay, so with that, I've covered the canvas. I've covered canvas scaling and anchoring. And there's a whole bunch of different options here too. You can choose to match different things as you're expanding and scaling. You can, there's all sorts of things you can change. It's worth having a play with. When it comes to wiring up events, it's pretty simple. You add that and you choose what you want to happen. So I've just realized I've been in play mode this whole time. That's awesome. So if I put a cube in my scene, move it so we can see it. I might want to make the button make that cube change color. So I can just move the cube onto it here. And I can say the mesh renderers. Actually, let's just set enabled. I can set it to set enabled to false so that when I click that button, it turns off. So it's pretty much the same as we wire up any Unity event. It's just there. And yeah, that's it for buttons. Right. One of the last bits I had to cover, sort of about the fundamentals, was performance considerations. So I talked about how 2D, I think I guess 3D is quite a bit different to 2D in the way that it renders. And one of the places where that's especially true is with positioning. In 3D kind of game objects, if I move the position of something to anywhere, it doesn't really cost anything. It is pretty much free. If I go this dot position equals that, because no matter what, every single frame, it's calculating the matrix for that transform to go from 3D space to screen space to camera space and everything like that, and sending it to a shader. It happens every frame anyway, so moving things around doesn't cost a thing. When you're moving things around in UI cases, it's actually a pretty hefty operation because it's got to think about this canvas scaling mode that it's dealing with. There's plenty of masking and things that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that like it's rendering like in an optimized way. But that means that because of all that masking that's being done, changes are more expensive. And yeah, I guess in general, it's just slower. So if you need to do if you want to do a 2D game, you generally don't want to use these UI components to do those games. These UIs are there for what's in the name. It's for UI, where you want lots of interaction and snappiness. You want those cool scaling options and things like that. But not if you're building a platformer, you want to say your character is 1.5 meters high. You don't want to have to say that 300 pixels high. And you want that high performance because every single frame that character is going to be moving around or jumping or having physics applied to it or whatever. That's got to sit in the 2D world. So you want to use these ones, these sprites and things here for your 2D objects, and keep these for your UI, for your menus and for your labels and things like that. In our sort of case, we're very rarely doing 2D stuff. Because we're in augmented reality, everything is in 3D space. So nearly every sort of bit of 2D stuff that we want to draw, we want to use these UI elements here. Okay, cool. So I guess, does anyone have any more questions or anything in particular they want me to go through? Otherwise, I can spend some time going through various types of UI elements here. Or if you want to I don't know how to do this particular thing in Unity. I can just live make that UI in front of you and you can follow along with that. I guess what would people prefer? Just shout it out in the chat or shout it out here.
I want to see how to make a custom button. Maybe.
So when you say custom button, what do you mean?
Like maybe a button from Blender shoved into here, and then you'll be able to press it and see it getting pressed, like the MRTK2.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that one, right? That's easy. You just put the button in there, and then the states are just the colors. What if you want to do more things other than that?
Yeah, So let's say you wanted to have a button that was like a fab button. Would that be a good example where you've got like an icon and some text on it as well? Is that the kind of thing?
Yep. That sounds good.
Yeah. Okay, so awesome. Step 1, make a circle.
My eyes are hurting.
This is for the designers out there. Let's go 256 by 256. Boom. Here's the circle. I'm not even going to hold shift down, so it's going to be slightly askew.
You know the buttons.
I'm just thinking Paint doesn't have transparency, does it? So it's going to be fun. You're just going to have to pretend there's transparency. All right, so I brought my fab in here. I'm going to turn it into a sprite because it's a sprite. And Because in this case, I don't want that stretching behavior. I just want it to stay the same size. I'm not going to change it to, I'm just going to keep it as a single sprite. So there we go. The pivot's in the center by default, which means the center of the button is how it gets positioned. And is going to do anything here? I was hoping I could change the transparent color. So just pretend this blue is transparent. Limitations. So the easiest thing to do would be just create an existing button. And then instead of using the default source image, use the new one that I just created. Set the size to be the same, so it's a nice circle. And if you want to change the tint color, you'll see that it just tints the whole thing. It multiplies the colors together to get it. So if I want a nice pink button, this is probably too big. I'm just going to just stick it down in the corner like that. The other thing that I probably want on this button is like an icon, right? I don't just want it to be a bit of text. So I'm going to just delete the text because that's how I roll. And I'm going to go UI, and I'm just going to create another image under that. So this image, it's going to be stuck in the middle center. And it's going to be 40 by 40, I guess. And then again, you just bring in the sprite that you want to use. I think there might be some existing ones. Here we go, look at that. So this one that I already had, it's one I prepared earlier. Yeah, and that's my fab. Is that the kind of thing you were looking for?
Yes, perfect. Our script went along really good.
Yeah, I find the 2D stuff is a lot easier to just create your own UI, because generally it's just what images do I need to put together and do it that way. And I would recommend doing it the same way I did it here, by having one background for the button itself and then different contents here, so that if you have a bunch of buttons, all you need to do is change that one icon on the top. And by keeping your images white, you can add that tinting to it, which, yeah, if you've got any sort of idea of what colors go together, you'd probably be able to do something good.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah.
Oh, I guess the other thing that I should cover that gets rather complicated, and I might not remember how to do it properly, is scrolling. So scrolling is a pretty common thing when it comes to 2D UI. And there is a scroll view that just comes out of the box. So this is sort of the top level one, which is, again, just an image with the color being sort of 40% transparent, opaque. And then it gets a scroll rect in it. So what this is responsible for is for making sure that nothing goes over the edge as you're scrolling. And it manages the UI elements for the scroll bars themselves. So it doesn't actually draw them, it just manages the ones that are there. So if I expand that, I have a horizontal and a vertical scroll bar. And they have their own sort of setup with handles and all that sort of happy fun stuff. The actual contents go inside the viewport. And you can see this has a fair bit of setup to it, right? So this has a mask UI here as well, which does something, I don't really know what. But then under that, you've got content. And then under your content is where you place the things that you want to scroll. So got that sort of content under here. Generally set those to stretch in both directions, I think. Actually, no, we'll stretch it across and make it anchor at the top. So I set the pivot point of y equals 1, so it's the top. And 0.5 is fine there. I don't know why that's not doing what I think it should be doing. Yeah, so the contents have to have enough space to fit all of the contents. So I'm just going to make that just 500 tall. All right, that's what I did wrong. Yeah, okay, cool. Going to leave enough space for the scroll bar on the side there. Yeah, okay. So there's my little scroll panel. I've got contents there. And theoretically, when I scroll that, it should move around with it. Since I've hit play. Yeah, so I think it's realized that there's nothing overlapping in the X direction, so it's hidden that scroll bar. But if I change this text to be wider, will that do it? And turn off wrapping. Yeah, look, I'm pretty new to the scrolling thing. But you sort of get the idea that the contents dictate the scrolling. It might just disappear. I think what happened there is, I think it only does the reflow on the initial layout, and you've got to tell it if you want it to reflow. So that's scrolling. The other pretty useful bit is when you're doing lists of things, often you want to stack them on top of each other and have a list of things. So I'll get rid of my scroll view, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a little menu on the side, which will start with a panel. And the panel is going to be on the, going to be stuck to the top left. Actually, it's going to stretch. It's going to be stuck to the left and stretch all the way from the top to the bottom, but it's only going to be 200 pixels wide. And over on the left there, I'm going to make it like a darker kind of color like that. So that's my panel. And then under this, I want to put a empty game object. So I'm just going to call this a container just because I can't think of a better name for it. I'm just going to say that's going to stretch the whole way. So it's the same size as the thing it's under. And what I'm going to put in here is called a vertical layout group. So this vertical layout group causes all of the children under it to stack on top of each other. A horizontal layout group is the opposite. It's like sideways stacking. So now whenever I put things under here, I'm just going to fill out with buttons. I just keep adding buttons. They sort of stack on top of each other. And this here describes how they stack on top of each other. So if you want it to control the child size, I can turn on height. And that means this control. Oh, why is it so big? So small. That's why. Yeah, sorry, I had the bottom set to 200 and something. Yeah, so in this case, as I add more buttons, it makes them all squish up into the space that's given to it. Whereas if I turn off control the child size, it'll keep the children at the same size, and it'll sort of space them out accordingly as I add them. If I add too many, it'll start appearing below the bottom. And that might be when you want to get your scroll bar to start coming into play and doing its thing. So that's worth playing around a bit. It takes a while to get how these play together, it gets especially difficult when the items inside here change in size depending on their content. So if you want to do an accordion style thing and have them still stack up on top of each other, the amount of settings you need to play around with here can grow pretty major. But yeah, you can add padding on various bits. You can add more spacing between the things or less spacing, negative spacing apparently. You can make them align at the bottom instead of the top. So say that. Sorry. You can see as I'm actually changing these values, the transform up here has its buttons grayed out, but it is actually changing the numbers inside those things. So the height is actually changing for these buttons whenever I add a new one, which is why when I go and change it to say, stop controlling the height, it keeps the existing height there. So it can get a bit confusing if you keep twiddling around with that in this kind of prototype sense. But yeah, anyway, that's how you do it. I think now if I delete a bunch of these, they'll be on the bottom left. Yeah. So they take up the whole space, but anchoring to the bottom left. Okay, cool. What else have we got here? Yeah, you've got toggle buttons, which are like checkboxes. I don't think you have radio buttons out of the box. You've got sliders. So the sliders are there. And then again, it's just a simple call this method whenever your value changes. Drop downs. I've never used drop downs. Oh, there you go. Just a bunch of options in there. So it's pretty powerful. You get a fair bit out of the box and it doesn't look terrible. And a lot of the times you can make it look good just by changing the images that you use here to, you know, a better one.